Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of Lord Lucan and the events of 1974. It is the 7th of November, a Thursday evening in London that began with the sort of biting, damp chill that only an English autumn can provide. Imagine yourself standing on the pavement of Lower Belgrave Street, where the grand, white-stuccoed houses of Belgravia rise up like silent sentinels against a bruised, violet sky. The air is still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of recent rain and the distant, low hum of the city's heart beating several blocks away. The street lamps cast long, flickering amber pools across the cobblestones, catching the glint of polished brass knockers and the deep, dark ivy clinging to the wrought iron railings. At number 46, the windows are glowing with a soft, domestic warmth, a stark contrast to the growing darkness outside. Inside this tall, elegant townhouse, the world feels insulated and quiet, yet beneath the surface of this aristocratic peace, the air is thick with a tension that has been brewing for years. In the upper reaches of the house, 3 young children are tucked into their beds, their breathing rhythmic and steady in the hush of the nursery. Their nanny, 29-year-old Sandra Rivet, moves through the hallways with a light, practiced step. Sandra was never meant to be here tonight. It was her scheduled evening off, a time for her to see her boyfriend and escape the rigors of her duties. But in a small twist of fate that would change everything, she had swapped her night, remaining in the house to care for the family she had grown so fond of. Downstairs, in the drawing room, Lady Veronica Lucan sits in the quiet. The room smells of old books, beeswax polish, and the faint, lingering aroma of afternoon tea. At approximately 8:55 in the evening, Sandra enters the room, her voice a gentle murmur in the stillness. She asks Veronica if she would like a cup of tea before the night fully settles in. With a small smile and a nod of gratitude, Veronica watches as the young woman turns and heads toward the basement, where the kitchen lies hidden in the belly of the house. The descent into the basement is a journey from the light of the upper floors into an oppressive, heavy gloom. As Sandra reaches the bottom of the wooden stairs, her hand reaches for the light switch, but the room remains swallowed by shadow. The bulb has been removed, unscrewed by a steady hand and placed carefully on a nearby chair, leaving the kitchen in a state of unnatural, hollow darkness. The only light comes from the pale, ghostly reflection of the moon through a small window. In that suffocating silence, the air feels different, colder, sharper. Suddenly, the stillness is shattered. A figure emerges from the blackness, a silhouette fueled by a desperate, jagged energy. A heavy length of lead piping, wrapped tightly in surgical tape to dampen the sound and improve the grip, is raised high. The first blow is swift and brutal, followed by several more in a rhythmic, sickening thud against the floor. Sandra has no time to scream, no time to understand that she has stepped into a trap meant for someone else. Her life fades into the cold linoleum as her attacker, breathing heavily in the dark, begins the grim task of concealing the evidence, lifting her limp form into a heavy, rough canvas mail bag. Minutes pass in the house above, stretched thin by a growing sense of unease. Lady Lucan remains in the drawing room, the ticking of the grandfather clock sounding like a hammer against the silence. The tea has not arrived. The house has become too quiet, the kind of silence that rings in the ears and makes the skin prickle with an instinctive warning. She rises from her chair, her silk dressing gown whispering against her legs as she moves toward the basement door. She stands at the top of the stairs, peering down into the well of darkness. She calls out Sandra's name, her voice trembling slightly as it echoes off the narrow walls. There is no answer, only a faint, scuffling sound from below. Driven by a mixture of concern and a rising tide of fear, Veronica begins to descend. She reaches the hallway near the cloakroom when the shadows move again. A hand, rough and familiar, clamps over her mouth, and the same lead pipe descends, striking her head. She feels the warm spread of blood across her scalp. the world spinning in a dizzying whirl of pain and confusion. In the struggle that follows, the attacker's voice slices through the dark, a sharp command to be silent. It is a voice she knows intimately, the voice of her estranged husband, the 7th Earl of Lucan. In a desperate bid for survival, she fights back, her fingers finding his throat, her teeth sinking into his hand. The violence is intimate, a terrible culmination of their fractured marriage. Eventually, the struggle pauses, both of them gasping for air in the narrow corridor. Veronica, sensing a fleeting chance, begins to speak with a terrifyingly forced calm. She asks him where Sandra is, and through the haze of his own panic, he admits that the nanny is gone, that she is in the basement. He leads her upstairs, his movements robotic and stiff. He sends the eldest daughter back to her room, his voice a hollow shell of its former self. In the bedroom, he tells Veronica to lie down, placing a towel beneath her head to keep the blood from staining the sheets. He moves to the bathroom to wet a cloth, the sound of the running tap filling the room. It is in this heartbeat of a second, while the water masks the sound of her movements, that Veronica finds the strength to run. She bolts from the room, her bare feet hitting the cold floorboards as she plunges toward the front door. She fumbles with the heavy lock, the brass handle slick with her own blood, until finally the door swings open and the freezing night air hits her face like a physical blow. She does not look back. She runs down the street, her nightgown fluttering like a white flag of distress in the darkness. She reaches the corner where the Plumber's Arms pub stands, its windows glowing with the comforting, amber light of a normal Thursday night. She bursts through the heavy wooden doors, a vision of absolute horror, her face a mask of red, her eyes wide with a primal terror. She screams for help, her voice cracking as she tells the stunned patrons that she has escaped, that her husband has murdered the nanny. As the patrons rise in confusion and the landlord rushes forward, the quiet life of Belgravia is shattered forever. Back at number 46, the house remains still, the basement holding its secret in the dark, while the Earl of Lucan begins a journey into the night from which he will never truly return. To understand the man who stood in the darkness of that Belgravia basement, we must step back from the blood and the screaming into the velvet-lined silence of the Clermont Club. Imagine the heavy scent of expensive cigar smoke clinging to the wallpaper, the low hum of voices speaking in the clipped tones of the British upper class, and the hypnotic, rhythmic click-clack of backgammon stones against a wooden board. This was the world of Richard John Bingham, the 7th Earl of Lucan. In the early 1960s, he was the very picture of aristocratic charm. He was a man of tall, straight stature with a thick mustache and eyes that seemed to perpetually calculate the odds. He lived a life that many only saw in the cinema, once even considered for the role of the fictional spy James Bond. But behind the sharp suits and the powerboats he raced across the choppy waters of the English Channel, a much darker current was pulling him under. It was here, amidst the silver service and the emerald-green bays of the card tables, that the man they called Lucky Lucan began to lose everything. The nickname Lucky was a cruel irony, a title bestowed upon him after a single, spectacular win at the game of Chemin de Fer that had netted him £26,000 in a single weekend. To a man whose annual salary at a merchant bank was a mere £500, it felt like a revelation from the gods of chance. He resigned from his job almost immediately, convinced that he could make a living by the turn of a card. But the cards are fickle mistresses. By the arrival of the 1970s, the luck had soured. He spent his days and nights in a repetitive, soul-eroding cycle. He would wake late, eat a lunch of smoked salmon and lamb chops at the club, and then settle into the gambling pits until the early hours of the morning. While he played, his wife, Veronica, was often relegated to what the members called the widow's bench, a quiet alcove where the wives of gamblers sat and watched their family fortunes evaporate into the smoky air. The sheer weight of his losses was staggering. By 1974, he was overdrawn at 4 different banks, including the prestigious Coutts and Lloyds. His total debt was spiraling toward £50,000, an astronomical sum for the time. He was a peer of the realm, who was essentially a beggar in a tuxedo. As his bank accounts drained, the walls of his personal life began to crumble with equal violence. The marriage to Veronica, which had begun with such high society promise in 1963, had turned into a bitter battlefield. The air in their home at 46 Lower Belgrave Street was thick with resentment and the heavy fog of depression. When the couple finally separated in 1973, Lucan moved into a small, cold flat nearby, but his mind never truly left the family house. He became consumed by a singular, burning obsession: the custody of his 3 children. He could not bear the thought of them being raised by a woman he believed to be mentally unstable. He began to stalk the streets of Belgravia, sitting in his car for hours, watching the windows of his former home through the rain-streaked glass. He even went so far as to hide tape recorders in the house to monitor his wife's private conversations. The legal fees for the custody battle were the final blow to his shattered finances. When the court eventually ruled in favor of Veronica, something inside the Earl seemed to snap. The gentlemanly facade, the stiff upper lip that had held firm through years of gambling losses, began to crack open, revealing a desperate, cornered animal. By November of 1974, the Earl of Lucan was a man living on borrowed time and borrowed money. His letters from the bank were no longer polite requests. They were demands that threatened his very status as a lord. He began to talk to his friends at the Claremont Club in terrifying terms, speaking of the need to eliminate his problems entirely. He felt the world was closing in on him, the shadows of the club lengthening until they touched every corner of his existence. He was drinking more heavily, his eyes bloodshot, his hands perhaps trembling slightly as he reached for a glass of vodka. He had convinced himself that if only he could remove the source of his misery, he could reclaim his children and his dignity. The plan he formed was born of a mind warped by debt and a misplaced sense of entitlement. He believed that he, a peer of the realm, could bypass the laws that governed ordinary men. He did not see the nanny, Sandra Rivet, as a person. In his mind, she was merely a shadow in a basement, a figure that stood between him and the life he felt he deserved. The gambler was about to place his final, most horrific bet, unaware that the house always wins in the end. The atmosphere of London on that Thursday, the 7th of November, was cold and damp. A typical autumn mist clung to the lamp posts of Belgravia, blurring the edges of the grand white stuccoed houses. Lucan had spent the afternoon in his usual fashion, but his routine was beginning to fail. He missed appointments with friends. He was seen driving a borrowed Ford Corsair, a dark and scruffy vehicle that was a far cry from the luxury cars he usually favored. Inside the car, hidden away, was a length of lead piping, wrapped carefully in surgical tape to provide a better grip. He waited for the evening to deepen, for the sounds of the city to soften into the muffled silence of the night. He knew the routine of the house perfectly. He knew when the tea was made, when the children were put to bed, and when the lights would go out. He stood in the shadows, a ghost of the man he once was, listening to the heartbeat of the house that had once been his. The debt was due, and the 7th Earl of Lucan was ready to pay it in the most violent currency imaginable. The borrowed Ford Corsair hummed with a low, mechanical rattle as it fled the suffocating weight of Belgravia. The steering wheel felt slick beneath his palms, a cold sweat mingling with the residue of a night that had already shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Behind him, the street lamps of London faded into a blurred, amber glow, replaced by the oppressive, velvet darkness of the open road. The air inside the small car was thick with the scent of damp wool and the sharp, metallic tang of something he refused to name. Every shadow that stretched across the asphalt seemed like a reaching hand, and every pair of headlights in the distance felt like a direct accusation. He pushed the engine harder, the needles on the dashboard glowing a dim, sickly green as he transitioned from the city's sprawl into the narrow, winding corridors of the English countryside. The transition from the frantic chaos of the basement to the rhythmic thrum of the tires was jarring, a descent into a different kind of nightmare where the silence was louder than the screams he had left behind. It was roughly 11:30 when the car slowed, its tires crunching over the gravel of a driveway in Uckfield, East Sussex. The house, belonging to his close friends Ian and Susan Maxwell Scott, stood as a bastion of normalcy in a world that had tilted off its axis. He stepped out into the biting November air, his movements stiff and mechanical. The night was profoundly quiet here, save for the distant rustle of dead leaves dancing across the lawn. He looked down at himself, noticing for the first time how the fabric of his trousers felt heavy and sodden against his skin. He had tried to scrub them in a moment of panicked clarity, but the moisture remained, a damp, clinging reminder of the basement floor. His hair, usually a mask of aristocratic precision, was ruffled by the wind and the struggle, falling over a face that had turned the color of weathered bone. When he finally raised a hand to knock, the sound seemed to echo through the entire sleeping village, a hollow thud that announced the arrival of a ghost. Susan Maxwell Scott opened the door to find a man who looked like a hollowed-out version of the Earl she knew. In the soft light of the hallway, his dishevelment was startling. He did not look like a murderer. He looked like a man who had been caught in a storm of impossible coincidences. She led him inside, the warmth of the home contrasting sharply with the icy chill radiating from his frame. There, in the quiet sanctuary of the living room, he began to weave a narrative that would become his final shield. He spoke of a walk past his wife's home, of glancing through a basement window and seeing a shadow locked in a violent struggle with Veronica. He described his own intervention, claiming he had rushed in only to slip in a pool of blood that had already claimed the floor. His voice was steady, yet underlined with a frantic need to be believed. He painted a picture of a man who was a victim of circumstance, an innocent witness who had been unjustly accused by a hysterical woman. As he spoke, the grandfather clock in the corner ticked away the minutes, marking the slow passage of his final hours in the world he had always known. While sitting in that room, the weight of the future seemed to settle on his shoulders. He asked for stationery, his fingers trembling slightly as he uncapped a pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, frantic scraping as he drafted letters to his brother-in-law, Bill Shand Kidd. These letters were not pleas for help, but instructions for a life he was preparing to leave behind. He wrote of his children, expressing a desperate, singular concern for their well-being, and of his debts, mentioning a planned sale at Christie's that he hoped would settle his accounts. He spoke of the traumatic night and the unbelievable coincidences that had conspired against him. On the edges of the white envelopes, small, dark smears began to appear where his fingers touched the paper, stains that he did not seem to notice, or perhaps simply chose to ignore. He was carefully constructing his legacy, ensuring that the last words the world received from him were a protest of innocence, a staged scene of a nobleman wronged by fate. As the clock moved toward 1:15 in the morning of Friday, the 8th of November, the visit reached its inevitable conclusion. He stood up, the exhaustion finally visible in the sagging lines of his posture. He declined any further hospitality, stating with a strange, haunting finality that he had to get back. Susan watched from the doorway as he returned to the Ford Corsair, the vehicle's engines sparking to life, with a puff of exhaust that vanished into the mist. He backed out of the drive, the red glow of his taillights lingering for a moment like two dying embers before being swallowed by the darkness of the Sussex lanes. He drove away from the only witnesses he had left, moving toward the coast, toward the sea, and toward a silence that would last for decades. The road ahead was a ribbon of blackness, and as he accelerated into the fog, The Earl of Lucan ceased to be a man of flesh and blood, becoming instead a shadow drifting toward the edge of the known world. The coastal town of New Haven sat beneath a heavy, bruised sky on the morning of Sunday, November 10th, 1974. The air here was different from the heavy, stagnant heat of London or the rolling greenery of Uckfield. It was thick with the scent of salt spray, decaying seaweed, and the sharp, metallic tang of the English Channel. Norman Road was a quiet, unassuming stretch of late Victorian red brick houses, the kind of place where the rhythmic crashing of the tide served as a constant, low-frequency heartbeat to the lives of its residents. It was not a place where one expected to find the remnants of a high-society tragedy, yet there it sat, huddled against the curb like a discarded secret. The car was a Ford Corsair, finished in a dull, unassuming shade of silver gray that seemed to absorb the damp mist rolling in from the harbor. It bore the registration plates Echo Kilo Yankee 448 Juliet. To a casual observer, it was merely an aging vehicle parked haphazardly in a row of others. But to the investigators who arrived that morning, it was the final, physical breadcrumb in a trail that had grown colder with every passing hour since the bloody events of Thursday night. The police moved with a slow, deliberate caution as they approached the vehicle. The silver paint was slick with a fine coating of sea salt and morning dew, reflecting the gray light in a way that made the car look almost spectral. When the officers first peered through the glass, they were met with a silence so profound it felt heavy. On the seat lay a pad of Lion brand writing paper, its white pages stark against the dark upholstery, a silent witness to the frantic letters written just 2 nights prior. As the door was unlocked, the hinges gave a sharp, rusted groan that seemed to echo down the narrow street. The interior air that billowed out was stale, carrying the faint, unmistakable odor of copper and old sweat. On the front seat, investigators found a scattering of dark, viscous stains. Forensic testing would later confirm these were splatters of blood, a grim mixture of Group Alpha and Group Bravo, mirroring the biological evidence found on the stairs of the house in Belgravia. The realization settled over the scene like a physical weight. The Earl had been here, and he had not been alone with his thoughts. He had been carrying the literal stains of that traumatic night across the upholstery of a car that did not even belong to him. The search moved toward the back of the car, where the heavy metal lid of the boot was pried open. Inside, the darkness of the trunk revealed items that would haunt the case for decades. Resting among the spare tire and a few stray tools was a length of lead pipe, approximately 3/4 of an inch in diameter. It was wrapped meticulously in heavy, industrial adhesive tape, the texture of the binding rough and tacky to the touch. It was a chilling twin to the weapon recovered from the basement in London, the one that had ended the life of Sandra Rivet. Next to this blunt instrument sat a full bottle of vodka, its clear liquid shimmering innocently in the coastal light, and a collection of items that seemed almost taunting in their specificity. Decades later, rumors would surface of 3 specific cards from the game of Cluedo being discovered within the vehicle. The card for the lead pipe, the card for the hallway, and the card for Colonel Mustard, a character whose iconic mustache and military bearing bore a striking resemblance to the 7th Earl of Lucan himself. Whether left as a final, macabre joke or a cryptic confession, the presence of these items turned the abandoned car into a theater of the bizarre. As the investigators cataloged the contents, the geography of New Haven began to loom large in their minds. Norman Road sat only a few hundred yards from the bustling ferry terminal, where ships regularly departed for the French coast. The ground beneath the car was damp, and the wind whipped up from the water, rattling the signs of local shops and bringing with it the distant, mournful cry of a foghorn. There were no witnesses who could definitively say they saw the tall, elegant figure of Richard John Bingham stepping away from the Corsair in the pre-dawn darkness of Friday morning, though some locals recalled a car being parked there as early as 5 or 8 o'clock. The trail simply stopped. There were no footprints leading into the churning, silt-heavy waters of the channel, nor were there any records of a tall, mustachioed man boarding a vessel under his own name. The car was a shell, a metallic husk left behind to tell a story of flight and desperation, while the man himself had stepped into the white noise of history. He had vanished into the mist, leaving behind only the blood of his victims and the cold, hard weight of a lead pipe. The discovery of the Ford Corsair marked the end of the physical pursuit and the beginning of a myth. In the days that followed, the police combed the cliffs and the shoreline, their flashlights cutting through the coastal fog like searching eyes that found nothing but salt and stone. They looked for a body in the surf, expecting the sea to surrender the Earl as it often did with those who sought the finality of the tides. But the water remained dark and secretive. The car was eventually towed away, leaving a clean, rectangular patch on the pavement of Norman Road, where the rain had not yet washed away the salt. To the people of New Haven, it was a momentary intrusion of a world far removed from their own, a world of gambling dens, titles, and high-stakes violence. But for the family in London, and for a public now gripped by the mystery, the empty driver's seat of the Corsair became a symbol of a void that could never be filled. The blood-stained car was a period at the end of a sentence that no one knew how to finish. As the sun began to set over the harbor on that Sunday evening, the realization took hold that the 7th Earl of Lucan was no longer a man to be found, but a ghost to be chased through the corridors of time. The investigation did not stop at the edges of the dark channel or the rusted metal of the abandoned Ford Corsair. Instead, it turned inward, toward the gilded, velvet-lined sanctuaries of the London elite. At number 44 Berkeley Square, the Claremont Club stood as a fortress of 18th-century elegance, its limestone facade hiding a world where the rules of common men seemed to dissolve into the mist of expensive cigar smoke and the clink of crystal decanters. Inside, the air was thick, heavy with the scent of aged brandy and the dry, metallic aroma of gambling chips being stacked and restacked on baize tables. This was the home of the Claremont set, the tight-knit circle of aristocrats and financiers who called the missing Earl their friend. When the detectives from Scotland Yard arrived, their heavy boots sounding out of place on the plush, hand-woven carpets, they were met not with the frantic energy of a search, but with a cold, polished wall of silence. The members sat in their high-backed leather chairs, their faces obscured by the shadows of the library, watching the officers with a detached, almost amused disdain. To them, the law was an intrusion, a clumsy guest at an exclusive party. The silence in those rooms was absolute, a heavy shroud that seemed to absorb every question the police could muster. At the heart of this circle was John Aspinall, the charismatic and ruthless owner of the club. Known to his friends as a Spurs, he was a man who famously preferred the company of wild animals to that of most humans. He operated a private zoo on his estates, a place where tigers and gorillas roamed behind iron bars, and he often spoke of the natural order in ways that chilled the blood of the working-class investigators. When Detective Chief Superintendent Roy Ranson pressed for information, Aspinall did not offer leads. He offered philosophy. He spoke of the aristocrat's duty to his own, suggesting that if a man like Lucan had indeed committed a terrible act, the only honorable course was to facilitate his disappearance or his end. The detectives felt the weight of a world they could not penetrate. They noted the way Aspinall's mother, known as Lady Osborne, spoke with a terrifyingly calm indifference, once joking to the press that the last she had heard, the Earl was being fed to the tigers at her son's zoo. It was a remark meant to mock, to lead the trail into the tall grass of absurdity, while the real movements of the missing man remained hidden behind the iron gates of private estates, and the loyalty of men who viewed the police as mere servants of a state they did not acknowledge. The theories began to swirl like the leaves in a cold London autumn, each one more extravagant than the last, fueled by the staggering wealth of the men involved. James Goldsmith, the billionaire financier and another pillar of the Claremont set, was a man of immense power and vengeful spirit. Rumors whispered of private planes idling on remote airstrips in the dead of night, their engines humming low as a tall, mustachioed man was hurried into the cabin. There were stories of safe houses hidden in the rolling hills of the English countryside, where the Earl might have sat by a roaring fire, sipping whiskey and listening to the wind howl against the stone walls, entirely invisible to the world. But the most persistent whispers pointed toward Africa. In the vast, sun-drenched landscapes of Kenya and Gabon, it was said that the Earl had found a new life among the expatriate communities, where a man's past could be buried under the red dust of the plains. Decades later, a secretary who had worked for the set would claim she had been instructed to book flights for Lucan's children to visit a man they did not know was their father, watching him from a distance in a foreign land. The thought of it was haunting. A father turned into a ghost, observing his own legacy through binoculars in the shimmering heat of a distant continent, protected by a network of money that knew no borders. Yet the wall of silence claimed its own victims. Dominic Elwes, a sensitive portrait painter and a member of the set, found himself caught in the crushing gears of aristocratic loyalty. He had been a close friend of the Earl since their school days, but he lacked the hardened coldness of Aspinall or Goldsmith. When he allowed a journalist named James Fox to peer into the inner workings of their world, and when a photograph he had taken of the set appeared in the papers, the circle turned on him with the speed of a cornered predator. He was blackballed from the clubs, his name whispered with venom in the drawing rooms he once frequented. He found his invitations dried up, his phone silent, and his place in society erased. The psychological pressure was immense, a slow freezing out from the only life he knew. In September of 1975, less than a year after the murder, Elwes was found dead in his apartment, having taken his own life. He left behind a note that cursed the leaders of the Claremont set for their cruelty. His death was a somber reminder that the protection offered by the elite was not a gift, but a contract written in blood and absolute compliance. To break the silence was to cease to exist, even if one remained alive. The police continued to knock on doors, but they were knocking on the hollow wood of a stage set. Every lead into the Claremont set's involvement seemed to evaporate just as it was being grasped. They followed reports of sightings from South Africa to the Australian outback, but each time they arrived, they found only shadows and mistaken identities. The frustration within Scotland Yard grew into a dull ache. They knew that in the days following the murder, a lunch had been held at Aspinall's house, where the inner circle had gathered to discuss the fate of their friend. What was said over those silver platters and fine china remained a secret, guarded as fiercely as a crown jewel. The detectives imagined the scenes. The low-voiced conversations, the strategic planning, the cold calculation of a group of men who believed they were above the reach of the common hangman. The investigation was not just fighting a man who had fled. It was fighting a system of class and privilege that had existed for centuries, a structure designed to protect its own from the consequences of the world outside. As the weeks turned into months, the trail grew cold, not for lack of effort, but because the truth was being held captive in the quiet rooms of Mayfair, where the clocks ticked with a slow, rhythmic precision, and the fireplace embers glowed like the eyes of a watchful beast. The year 1975 arrived with a heavy, damp chill that seemed to settle into the very stones of London. In a quiet courtroom, the air was thick with the scent of old parchment and the faint, sharp tang of floor wax. A jury of 33 men and women sat in a silence so profound you could hear the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Each second, a hammer blow against the legacy of the 7th Earl of Lucan. For 31 minutes, they deliberated in a small room where the light filtered through gray windows, casting long, dusty shadows across the floor. When they returned, the verdict was a tectonic shift in the history of the British peerage. For the first time in centuries, an aristocrat was named a murderer at an inquest without a trial. The name Richard John Bingham was etched into the records not as a socialite or a gambler, but as the man who had taken the life of Sandra Rivet. The gavel fell with a dull, final thud, yet the man himself was nowhere to be found. He had become a ghost, a flicker of movement in the peripheral vision of a nation, leaving behind a trail that ended abruptly at the edge of the sea in New Haven. The blood-stained Ford Corsair they found, there was a hollow shell, its interior smelling of copper and cold vinyl, abandoned to the salt spray of the English Channel. As the 1970s faded into the 80s, the ghost of Lord Lucan began to wander the globe. He was no longer just a man. He was a myth, a phantom spotted in the humid heat of a Melbourne bank or the golden, dusty plains of Botswana. In 1974, a man was arrested in Australia, the police convinced they had finally cornered the elusive Earl, only to find they had captured a disgraced member of Parliament named John Stonehouse, who had faked his own drowning. The world watched, breathless, as these false dawns multiplied. There were whispers of a silver-haired Englishman living in a Buddhist commune in Perth, his voice carrying the unmistakable, clipped cadence of Eton. There were stories of a man called Jungle Bari in the vibrant, chaotic streets of India, a figure who played music and lived a life of nomadic simplicity, worlds away from the velvet-lined walls of the Claremont Club. Each sighting was a ripple in a dark pond, a brief moment where the public believed the shadows might finally speak. But as each lead dissolved into the mist, the silence from the aristocratic circles grew louder. The wealthy friends of the Claremont set remained like statues in a gallery, their expressions unreadable, their secrets tucked away in the pockets of their tailored coats, beneath the faint aroma of expensive cigars and aged brandy. Back in Belgravia, the silence was of a different kind. At number 46 Lower Belgrave Street, the house remained a monument to that one terrible night in 1974. Lady Lucan, Veronica, lived a life increasingly isolated, a woman haunted by the memory of a lead pipe and the voice of a husband she once loved. She could often be seen walking her small dog through the neighborhood, a slight figure against the grand, white stuccoed terraces. The air around her always seemed a little colder, the shadows of the plane trees a little longer. She spoke of the night with a detached, crystalline clarity, believing until her final days that her husband had taken the ultimate gambler's exit, throwing himself into the churning, black propellers of a cross-channel ferry. For her, there was no mystery, only a lingering, jagged grief that never quite healed. Her children grew up in the long shadow of a father who was neither dead nor alive, a man whose portrait hung in the mind like a smudge of charcoal. George Bingham, the son who would one day inherit the title, lived through decades of what-ifs, watching as the press treated his family's tragedy as a perpetual tabloid game, a hunt for a man who had become a caricature of the fugitive aristocrat. The decades rolled on, turning the scandalous news of the 70s into the historical curiosities of the new millennium. It wasn't until 2016 that a sense of legal finality finally arrived. In a high courtroom far removed from the feverish energy of the original investigation, a judge sat beneath the royal coat of arms. The air was still, the only sound the rustle of silk robes and the soft scratching of pens. Under the Presumption of Death Act, which had only recently come into force, the judge issued a death certificate for the 7th Earl of Lucan. It was a piece of paper that did what 42 years of police work could not. It officially declared that Richard John Bingham was no more. George Bingham stepped out into the London air as the 8th Earl, his face a mask of quiet relief. He spoke of a desire to move on, to let the dark curtains of the past finally close. But even with the certificate in hand, the questions remained, tucked into the corners of old London clubs and whispered in the pubs of Belgravia. Did he really drown in the cold waters of the Channel? Or did he spend his final years in the sun-drenched silence of Africa, protected by a network of friends who valued loyalty over the law? The truth is buried beneath layers of time, as inaccessible as the bottom of the deep sea. In 2017, Lady Lucan passed away in the same neighborhood where it all began, found unresponsive in her home. Her death felt like the final period at the end of a long, tortured sentence. The house at 46 Lower Belgrave Street stands there still, its windows reflecting the shifting gray clouds of a London afternoon. To walk past it now is to feel the weight of a story that refuses to be fully told. The mystery of Lord Lucan has become a part of the city's folklore, a ghost story for the modern age. It is a tale of privilege and desperation, of a man who thought he could gamble with fate and a family that paid the price for generations. As the street lamps flicker on in the gathering dusk, the fog rolls in from the Thames, blurring the edges of the grand houses and the narrow mews. The world has moved on. The faces in the Clermont Club are different now, and the name Lucan is a fading echo in the halls of history. We are left only with the silence and the shadows that dance in the basement windows. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.